you don't, there are some spaces where folks can fit in. All right?
Many people oftentimes felt that the word itself left out the history or left out individual voices, and it was oftentimes defined in the media by white men. And at the end of the day, when I look at myself in the mirror, I'm a black woman, and I didn't quite know where I fit in that.
Feminism, at the beginning, profoundly makes people uncomfortable.
In fact, I never identified as a feminist. And it's largely because I guess the images I had of what a feminist was growing up were really these images of white women and privilege.
The act of creating who I was as someone who was born female was very much a feminist act that was on the shoulders of so many freedom fighters before me.
When in the 60s and 70s, there was one way to express your feminism. And I think today, there are just as many ways as there are women.
As a woman with a disability, traditional white middle-class feminism never worked for me. Because I was never going to be equal to a white man.
We all come to the table with our own stories. You know, we bring, I want to call it our personal histories, and we often bring the collective histories of whatever tribe we come from with us.
Feminism is a question, and the question is what truths are missing here. And so in that sense, my feminism is always intersectional, because intersectional feminism is to always ask what truths are missing here, what voices aren't being heard here, who isn't at the table that you don't even realize is not at the table.
21st century feminism really needs to center those most impacted and look at all the conditions that women face.
I was raised by a feminist. I was raised not to be a feminist, but to have a level of understanding of human interaction and human justice. And I think, you know, in that environment, it was easy for me to be like, yes, I'm a feminist. It wasn't like a hard thing for me to say.
When I move throughout my day, I really try to align my politics using an intersectional feminist lens, which means that I make decisions on, is this good for a poor black woman?
What defines me as a feminist is this core belief that all individuals, men, women, and anybody who defines themselves in between, should have access to the social, political, and economic equality that this world presents to us.
What makes me a feminist is that I understand that if women aren't free, I can never be free. You know, as a gay man, really understanding that their struggle is actually my struggle too.
The feminist values that I want to raise Sarah with are an understanding that every single person is equal.
My feminism is a form of faith. It's a form of faith. It is having the faith to believe, do you know what I mean, that women are whole, complete, you know, human beings and should have all the rights and privileges of every male human being on the planet.
Feminism is the social, economic, and political equality of
all genders.
All genders. All genders.
That's a great start to our panel this morning. That's all right, that's a sign. So if you have an empty seat and next to you, feel free to come on down, make some noise. We don't really care, we're just here. Everybody's here, everybody's welcome. And be comfortable too, don't feel like all tied up. We're just loose here. So this panel is called Patriarchy, Feminism, and Women in Social Movements. And if you'll remember from our conversation last night, one of the questions was this idea of patriarchy and whether it's the root cause of sort of all of the forms of oppression that we see, especially in the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. And so this panel is really going to dig in deep and discuss and define patriarchy and feminism in our own terms. And I think Michelle Alexander sort of really laid the groundwork for defining things on our own terms, which is something we all do as practitioners. So we want to just continue that conversation around feminism and patriarchy. And our panel facilitator this morning is Soffiyah Elijah. And so when I see Soffiyah's name, in my mind, I always read it as Soffiyah. And I don't want you guys to call her that because that's not the way her name is pronounced. And I know someone with a name that looks a certain way and people say another way. So she's Soffiyah, but to me, she's Soffiyah. I met her in Harlem with Gina. And I remember Gina telling me, you need to get connected with this woman. And unfortunately, I haven't yet. But I know from this weekend that I am definitely going to do that because really when I look at what she's done, it's really sort of kind of the path that I'm taking. She started at Neighborhood Defender Service, which is sort of my role model public defender office. It's the way that I think a lot of our public defender offices should look. Community-based, holistic, for the people, and the attorneys look like the people. So she started there, and then, no, I think she started at Legal Aid actually, but then went to NDS. And I'm at Legal Aid now. We probably could have a whole conversation about that. But now, she's the executive director of the Correctional Association in New York. It's an over 100-year organization. She's the first woman, the first person of color to lead that organization. And they're really doing great things around prison reform, prison abolition. And as she mentioned in the circle yesterday, they recently got this victory, which I think is awesome, to prevent and stop the shackling of pregnant women who are incarcerated. And in doing my research, I found that really what part of that is that, corrections folks aren't even in the room when folks are giving birth, women are giving birth. And I think that's just awesome. And so I'm really excited for her to lead this panel and facilitate it for us. I'm going to welcome Soffiyah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really honored to be here. And I have an amazing group of panelists that are joining me. So I'm just going to introduce them and have them come on up, and then we'll get started. So let's start with Dr. Melina Abdullah, who's professor and chair of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and the Black Lives Matter. And then we have Surina Khan, who's CEO of the Women's Foundation of California. We're going to put a hurting on this issue this morning. Next, Dr. Ula Taylor, professor of African American Studies, University of California, Berkeley. And last but not least, Teresa Younger, president and CEO of the Ms. Foundation for Women. All right, so we're going to shake a few things up this morning. So you know what the topic is, right? And we talked a little bit about it yesterday. Patriarchy. How many people in here have a definition for patriarchy? Nobody did their homework, ladies. You're going to have to help them out. Well, I'm going to tell you what I found on Google, and then I'm going to ask our panelists. So, according to Google, patriarchy is a system of society or government in which the father or oldest male is head of the family and descent is traced through the male line. Or a system of society or government in which men hold the power, sound familiar, and women are largely excluded from it, also sounds familiar. And last but not least, a society or community organized on patriarchal lines. So my first question, I'm just going to pass the mic on down. I will not pass the mic on down.
That's all yours, Sophia.
First, I'm going to ask each of my panelists if you would briefly say what patriarchy means to you. And I'll start with you, Melina.
So
since it's brief, I'll say that I'll go with answer number 2, right? That we're really talking about the construction of a system where men hold the power at the expense of women. I think as a black woman, it's really important, though, that we not kind of pull out patriarchy and not include the entire hegemony. So we're really talking about a system that is white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism. And
can you fit any more in that definition?
That's short. And that's kind of what keeps us in the position that we're in a constant state of struggle, in a movement that we have to immerse ourselves in. As Bell Hooks says, feminism is a movement to end sexism and sexist oppression. And if we think about the larger struggle, it's a movement to really overthrow that existing hegemony.
Okay, Surina, try to follow that.
Okay, well, I was really struck in the Ms. Foundation video about the young woman who said that I was not raised by a feminist and I was not raised to be a feminist. And that resonated with me because I grew up in a patriarchal family. So for me, that means that the men are in control, the women are cared for. And so just to give you an example, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. My name is Surina, my middle name is Afzal, and my last name is Khan. And each one of us 6 children, has the same middle name because it signifies that we are the daughter of Afzal Khan, our father. And that is true for all my cousins. And so it's a patriarchal society. When there's a dispute in the family, a property dispute where, by law, men inherit twice what their sisters do. So this is true in my family. And when we say that's not right, it goes to the tribal elders, to a loya jirga, which is made up of all of our elder male relatives. And so to me, that is, a definition of patriarchy that I grew up with.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a family where my mother wanted a patriarch. For my family, my mother wanted my father to be a provider. My mother wanted my father to protect my family. And my mother wanted a certain amount of respect as a woman who wanted to stay at home and raise her children. And so my mother wanted a patriarch, but my father was unable to be the patriarch that my mother wanted him to be because of capitalism in America. And I think what happens is that when men are unable to engage in patriarchy in terms of being a provider, in terms of being a protector, that they pull on other kind of masculine ways of flexing patriarchy, which are steeped in power, which are steeped in domestic violence. So for me, I understand why women are drawn to the idea of patriarchy, because it implies a certain kind of freedom. A freedom to have the choice to raise your children in your home, the freedom to have a husband who can go out and earn an income and be a breadwinner. So I understand that, but it's very, very difficult to be a patriarch and not have the baggage that's linked to not being able to provide.
Yes.
Thank you. Teresa.
Okay. Amazing. I said when I was asked to be on this panel, I actually just wanted to listen to these ladies. So if you see me sitting here with my mouth dropping open, it's out of the enormous respect. And what each of them has said is so amazingly true. For me, patriarchy, in a very simplistic form, is the idea that the male is the center of the universe and all things relate and contribute to how he feels at the end of the day and how and what that needs to look like. So we set up our governmental structures that way, we set up our households that way, we define power that way, all through a decision-making process, which for me patriarchal is also about not just capitalism, but dictatorship. And it says that there is one and only one way to look at the world, and that is through the eyes of this centralized male figure. And that for me is patriarchy. And I will say this one aspect of it. On the wall of the Ms. Foundation, when all of you come to visit us, you will find these words on the wall, because we believe that patriarchy exists, but we believe that we are there to rebuke it. And so these words are on the wall, and it's the reason why I accepted the position to work at the Ms. Foundation. It says, "We believe in a just and safe world where power and possibility are not limited by race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability, or age. We believe that equality and inclusion are the cornerstones of a true democracy in which truth and dignity are valued in every person. So, well, patriarchy exists, and I believe it is the bedrock of what is wrong oftentimes in our society. We are going to debunk it at the Ms. Foundation.
Well, from the various answers we've received, it seems that each of my panelists has a different perspective, shall I say, on patriarchy. And I want to share with you a little anecdote that's going to feed into our next question. Was a man named Albert Noah Washington, who was known as a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, and was incarcerated for well over 20 years in the United States. And he was held in solitary confinement for a long time and subjected to many of the horrors that we know happen to people who are incarcerated. And many of you have heard of the sexism and chauvinism that allegations against members of the Black Panther Party over the years. And sometimes that's used to debunk anything else that the party stood for. But we won't get into that conversation today. But what I want to share with you is this. Noah became very, very sick in prison due to medical neglect. And about a week before he died, I had an opportunity to visit him. And I had visited him most of the time that he was incarcerated. And I said to Noah, what is the message? What is it that you'd like to be remembered for? To particularly younger activists going forward who may study your life and want to know what to take from it as a guiding principle. Now, I described him on purpose for you before sharing what his answer was, because I must admit the answer he gave was not what I expected. It took a long time, and then he said, well, you know, Soffiyah, many people say that women hold up half the sky. Something, okay, where's this going? He said, but the truth of the matter is, and I want you to tell everyone, that Noah said it's at least 3/4. And the reason that particularly resonated with me was that a person described as I described Noah, probably none of us would have ever expected that would be his answer to the legacy he wanted to leave. His profound recognition of the role that women played in being the bedrock of keeping at least his community afloat. So I share that to feed into my next question. There was a time, at least for people of African descent, that the society was matriarchal, and that the route to the kingship came through women, the route to wealth, women were the channels of spiritual power, and viewed to be the direct connection to God for the community. So something clearly has arguably changed. And this time I'm going to start with Teresa and come this way. And Teresa, I'd like for you to share, from your perspective, how is it that we in 2016 have a very different view of what has happened with women compared to at least the role that women played in ancient Kemet?
Wow. So
nothing happened.
So, you know, my perspective on this is that we as women, over time, have forgotten to tell and own our own stories. We have let the general society suppress those stories as not valuable, and not valuable in the total context that not only do they hold value within ourselves and in our families, but they hold value within society. And so we don't want to continue to tell all of the successes, and we don't. And we don't share those intergenerationally, and then we don't share those because at this point, we don't sit at enough tables together, just in friendship and just in openness. I mean, this weekend is unique in that experience. But honestly, when was the last time women, as they moved in professional fields, as our jobs, as our responsibilities in the home got larger, as our responsibilities in society got larger, have we sat down with those who are not like-minded and felt comfortable enough to share our stories where they would not be judged And so I think the difference between our ancestry and today, where there were circles around a fire where you had conversation and you shared story, and it was never a surprise that your ancestor had been raped. It was never a surprise that she had to battle in a conversation to get her voice known. It was never a surprise that the opportunities that you were being given were not given to her, because she understood the importance of raising up the next generation, and that happened in conversation. And I think in this day and age, we don't have enough conversation to value our own stories. And you will see constantly the importance of storytelling, whether it is amongst our Indigenous and Native sisters, or whether it is amongst ourselves. It is important that is, I think, for me, one of the most key and important components about why we are not. And I also believe then we have systems that have bought into that. So we continue to have political systems and media systems and economic systems that then, disenfranchise women in so many ways and don't add value to the voice that they bring to the table. So we just cut them out of the conversation. And somebody has got, in a patriarchal society and in a hierarchy, somebody's got to be at the top, so somebody's got to be at the bottom. And I think that is what has happened over time, is we, in an attempt to lift people up, and we saw this yesterday, right? A conversation between racism and feminism or sexism, right? Was what was worse, right? We have to find how we get to the bottom instead of how we get to the top, and we need to work on how we get to the top and raise all those levels up.
Thank you. Ula.
I would
What's
say,
happened?
Okay, I would say that the confusion is rooted in slavery. I would say that matriarchy and patriarchy are pitted against each other, so that matriarchy is understood as emasculating black manhood. And so matriarchy, meaning quote, quote, head of household, right, becomes a way in which to emasculate or feminize men. And so what has happened under these conditions is that single female-headed households become pathologized as not allowing black men to be men. And so what we see happening is that matriarchy becomes a way in which to understand black womanhood as emasculating black men, as opposed to matriarchy being black women owning themselves.
Well, that was pretty heavy. Surina.
Well, to add to that, I think that it really comes down to power and systems and representation. So over time, if we think about where we are today in 2016, women are underrepresented in every sector. Women of color are even more underrepresented in every sector. Whether you're talking about the nonprofit sector, we are not in leadership at the same level as men are. Similarly, surely in the corporate sector, in government, entertainment, wherever you look, there is a lot for us to do. And so the representation piece is really important, but it's not just about being inclusive, because we can't just go sit at the table if we don't know how to talk at that table, or we don't know how to be at that table. So that's why I think the work that Essie is doing here this weekend, but over the past year, and I'm so proud and grateful, first of all, to be here this weekend, and also for the Women's Foundation of California to be hosting Essie, because for us, it is about building the leadership of women of color, low-income women, immigrant women, to lead, because we have the best solutions, because we deal with the problems in our communities. And so I think, how we got here over time is about the systems that we operate in. So we're operating in a capitalist system that is going to, benefit some people, and it's going to keep others down. And so it's really time for us to shift those systems so that everybody benefits, and I think that we have those solutions.
Thank you, Surina. Melina,
So thank you for rooting us in who we really are, right? So as African women,
we came here with something. And I think it's really important that we understand that hegemony that we talked about, this white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative, capitalist system, is the imposed piece. But that doesn't mean that we completely kind of accept it. We've always rebelled, we've always resisted, and so I think that it's important that we understand. I love what Dr. Taylor was saying when she was kind of talking about, this idea of matriarchy. So in pre-colonial Africa, we know that we practice, the vast majority of the continent practiced non-hierarchical matriarchy, right? And so we came here, when we were captured and brought here, we came here with this. And Angela Davis writes about this. If there's any silver lining of slavery, she says, it's that we were able to maintain some of that under enslavement, because we were chattel. They didn't care what our, gender relationships were as much, right? And so it's only after kind of slavery begins to, we begin to shake off the chains of slavery that we begin to mimic the gender roles of white folks, right? And so this idea of patriarchy in black communities is really an imposed system that never really sat right. That's why our grandmothers are so respected. That's why, football players and singers are always saying, "Thank you, mama," right? And so it's really important that we kind of understand, I think, also the value of this moment when we think of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's really important that we understand it and how we define it as a womanist black nationalist movement with a queer and trans lens, right? It's a reclamation of who we really are as African women and as African people, and kind of saying just because you imposed a system doesn't mean we have to accept it.
It's getting warm up here. Well, I said I was going to warm things up. Okay. So now, we've heard some really interesting perspectives. And I'm now going to challenge each of you. And I want you to roll the clock back. We don't have to ask how far the clock's going to roll back. But I want you to each think about when you were about 16 years old. Some roll back a little longer than others. But think about how you viewed the world when you were 16. And whether or not, if someone had said to you when you were 16, "Welcome to the world of feminists, my sister. Come into this fold, and you are going to have a place at the table of changing the world." How would you, and I'll start with you, Surina, this time, how would that invitation, quote unquote, have struck you when you were 16?
Welcome to the world of feminism?
Yes.
16, I was working at McDonald's, flipping burgers. I was also running track. I was an athlete, student athlete. I was also braiding hair, making my little money on the side. Let's see. So I would be bringing that to the table. So if someone were to ask me, "Welcome to the world of feminism," I would say, I've been introduced to feminism before I came to this table. I would say that I've been introduced to something called black feminism before I came to this table. I would say that I was raised by a grandmother who loved the Lord and loved herself, and who loved her children and loved her grandchildren. I would say that and who would fight for them. I remember, so I probably would tell the story of migration. I'll tell you guys the story real quick. My grandmother was born and raised in Oklahoma, migrated to New Mexico, and in New Mexico she married my grandfather. And her children were going to school there, and the teacher was calling my aunt, her oldest child, nigga. And so my grandmother went to school, beat up the teacher.
That sounds like power.
But that was the first fight. And so then my grandmother saw her in the supermarket, beat her up again. And then my grandmother saw her a third time and beat her up again, and they put her in jail. And so it was at that point that, you know, the police and stuff told my grandfather, no, you guys got to leave town. And so that's how we migrated to California, because my grandmother was like, I didn't go from Oklahoma to New Mexico to have somebody abuse my child. And so I would say that those are the kind of stories I was raised with. And it was difficult because I've never been a fighter. I'm scared, I'm scary. But my cousins were. But my cousins, it's good to have cousins like that when you're scared. So I would say that, so I would have brought to the table a fighting spirit. I would have brought to the table a spirit of feeling worthy to have it all. I would have brought to the table a working spirit, the fact that I was at McDonald's because, you know, my mother was like, you know, you 16, you can work. And school is a job, but you need to have a double job. The spirit of working. And I would say that, most importantly, I would say that I brought to the table a spirit of the importance of loving people around you. And I'm hoping that that would be the core of the feminism that they would share with me.
Thank you. Surina, age 16. Welcome to the world of feminism.
Okay, age 16. Welcome to the world of feminism. I turned 16 at the end of 1984. I was in school at an all-girls school, and if somebody had said to me, welcome to the world of feminism, I probably would have first said thank you, because I was raised to be polite, and then I also would probably be thinking, I don't really know what else to say, because what I probably wanted to say is, what is that? Because I really didn't know. I grew up in a conservative family, and I use myself as an example of effective movement building, because in 1984, Reagan was president of the United States. In 1980, he ran against George Bush Sr. in the primary. My parents were really working for George Bush Sr. They loved him, my mother in particular. And so that's what I grew up with. And a couple years later, when I turned 18, I voted for the first time in my first presidential election. And I voted as a Republican, a young Republican, for George Bush Sr.
We forgive you.
So welcome to the world of feminism did not happen for me until a little bit later. And it happened because of my sexuality. I came out around that time as a lesbian. And then I began to see things in a bigger way, in a way that I thought, wait a minute, a lot of these people don't like me for this one reason. And so that began to open me up politically. And that's how I began my activist work in the LGBT, back then the lesbian and gay movement, in the LGBT movement, which has been my home since I started. And that was my introduction to feminism. So for me, it's a journey, and I think that in terms of movement building, you know, the people around me, the ones, you know, who are still around me that came before me, are the ones that invited me in, explained a larger vision that was compelling for me, and moved me. And I think movement building is ultimately about moving people, which means you have to meet them where they are, and you have to provide a reason, you know, a compelling vision to move.
Thank you. Okay, Melina, 16, welcome to feminism.
So, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what Michelle Alexander was saying last night, and I don't know, I always resisted the term feminism. I never defined myself as a feminist. And I think that I always understood the power of women. I was raised by my mother across the street from my great-grandmother, and women are really important. I mean, women have always been my roots. right? But I remember, so I'll tell two quick stories. When I was 16, I was a high school dropout, and I was fly as hell, right? So,
definition of fly. She was all that and a bag of chips.
So I'm from East Oakland. I know a lot of people are from the Bay. I'm from an area called Funktown. I don't know if y'all still know that, right? But it's, at the time, it was like, there were two neighborhoods in East Oakland that were like the center of the crack cocaine epidemic, and Funktown was one of them, right? And so I was young and cute and fly, and I modeled hair, and I didn't think I needed to go to high school anymore. And at the same time, there's this other space, right? Because Oakland is also the home of the Black Panther Party, right? So there's this, I'm the Panther Cub generation, right? So we kind of breathe that in, we live that, right? And so there's this piece in me that's still also kind of a resistor, a rebel, I mean, I know we need to smash on the system, but I'm still gonna get my hair done, right? And nails, right? Yeah, and I had the long acrylic nails, right, with the charms on each nail, right? Snake skin on the pinky, right?
Welcome to the world of feminism.
So that's who I was at 16, but if we fast forward to 21, through some miracle, I wound up going to college, went to Howard. They didn't know what independent studies was, so they thought I had a 4.0, not that I was prepping for the GED, right? So I got into Howard. At 21, I'm starting my first year of grad school, and I'm walking out of a seminar with this white woman who become like one of my good friends, a sister named Gail. And we're walking out, and she actually asked me the question. So she turns and she goes, we were doing some reading, and she goes, yeah, so for us feminists, and I stopped her and I said, I ain't no damn feminist. I want a man to open the door for me, and I do not want to pay for my own dinner, right? Because that's what I thought feminism was, right? Like, I don't want to burn a bra, I don't want to grow underarm hair, right? And, you know, it took me a long time, you know, after reading bell hooks and other folks, to understand feminism as a movement to end sexism and sexist oppression. So at 16, I'd have said hell no. I wouldn't have even listened. At 21, I was still hell no, but now at 29, right? I've incorporated into part of who I am.
That's evolution. Teresa, 16 and welcome to feminism.
So I want to go to where I was at 16 because it's a very different world than most of you are probably in. I was an Air Force brat also. We traveled around the world, and until I was 11, I lived in 6 different places. And when I was 11, we moved to North Dakota. Yes, it's a state in this country, not the most diverse location in the world. And in fact, I have 5 siblings. 3 are adopted. One's Korean, one's Amerasian, and one is mixed race, black and white. And then I have 2 natural brothers. My father is Native American, and so we have our mixed black and Native American. And so we moved to Minot, North Dakota, when I am 11. Okay, so understand this aspect of who I am. My only identity, I actually thought makeup came no darker than suntan. And so my own identity at that moment at 16 was all over the place, right? So the idea of feminism at 16 was in a very, very different space for me. I was questioning so much, not just my identity, my political identity, which was fiercely liberal and very inclusive. I at 16 in a Catholic high school in Minot, North Dakota, was the young woman who was driving people to Planned Parenthood, who was tracking and challenging conversations that were going on and announcing the discussion around Title IX, because I too was an athlete. So I was a cheerleader, and then I would cheer at the football game, and then we were a small school. So that meant I then had to change into my basketball uniform and, then play varsity basketball, right? So this is the environment I was in. And the other side of what I will say is I'm a Girl Scout. From age 5 on, I was a Girl Scout and am a Girl Scout today. So for me, a conversation about anything was, how do I make a difference? And how do we get to fairness? And so if you had asked me at 16 around feminism or welcome to the table of feminism, I would have said, I deserve to be here. Now what are we talking about? Right? So how are we going to fix that? In fact, nobody had said movement building was abstract to me. And in fact, I would tell you, I probably, I really didn't understand feminism. I didn't come to this work from a perspective that was education based in feminism or based in women's rights or based in anything else. I believe that Juliet Gordon-Low, who started Girl Scouts, was probably one of the earliest feminists in this country, who was breaking down barriers and building movements and engaging in leadership and making change happen. But I didn't know that. And I don't know that I knew any aspect of what to term what I was doing or how I was participating in society as anything other than the obligation to make the world better for the next generation. And until I was probably 32, I don't know that it came to terms with me. I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, I have come to terms with what feminism is and what it means, and it is why the video is so relevant to the work I'm doing now. So if you had said to me, welcome to the table, I said I should have been there. I would have spent the next a day and a half reading everything I could get my hands on to know why I was sitting there. But I definitely think, in general, if you had said something, if you hadn't welcomed me till I was 21 or till I was 30, I would have said I have no idea what you're talking about.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody on the panel for their candor. Now, of course, those of you who know me, there's a reason I asked that question. Because I think that it's fair to say the majority of young women who are 16 years old in our communities, of all races, are challenged by, well, what would that mean if that question was put to them today? That invitation, welcome to the world of feminism. So I would like to know from the panelists, what would you tell them? Who wants to go first?
Well, I have the mic. I don't know if that means I want to go first. I think welcome to the world of feminism to young women today. I feel like it's a different world, and I know that we have a lot of people here who might have more to say because they were probably younger than 16 in 1984. So I think that the world today is different, and that's because while we have a lot of work to do, the world today is different in terms of younger people being exposed through technology, social media. Our access to information is different. There are lots of different groups. Jackie from Spark is here. What Gina's doing again with Essie and Lily and all the other Essie women are engaging younger people. There are organizations that are specifically about engaging younger women. So I feel like we have a huge infrastructure of organizations that are working in this area. And what I would say is that feminism is about building equity for women to be able to lead. And so for us, at the Women's Foundation of California, I know there are a number of our Women's Policy Institute fellows here, and I wish you would just raise your hand so we could see you. The people who have gone through the program, there are alums, there are, and these are women who are learning how to change California through the public policy process. learning how to do it by experiencing, how to move a policy through the legislature. Now, 13 years later, 25 of their policy projects have been signed into law, including the banning of shackling women who are incarcerated when they're pregnant in California, amongst many other policy projects. So what I would say to young women today about what feminism is that you have the power, you hold the power to make this world a better place, and you can do it in any number of ways that feels comfortable for you, but you have to learn how to do it. You have to equip yourself to lead and to represent your community so that we can really make the world a better place for everybody, because when women lead, everybody benefits.
3/4 of the sky. Dr. Taylor?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow. I would say to a young woman, I know you're confused. I would say, I know you're confused about this feminism stuff because you're hearing sound bites and snatches of what feminism is. I would say that you've heard people say Beyonce's a feminist because in one song she quotes a feminist. You hear people identify Nicki Minaj as a feminist because she's embraced her sexuality and is flexing it in ways that are empowering for her. I would say that what's important to understand is that feminism is political, and that I would encourage everyone to understand that a feminine body doesn't mean a feminist consciousness, and that it takes a certain level of courageousness and boldness to say that I'm going to step out and engage in a political movement that empowers women, and that in doing that, sometimes you have to shake loose from the individual, and it's hard. But you have to think about the world beyond yourself. And you have to think about the kind of world that you want, that you may not actually live in, but you want other people to experience after you.
Let's clap it up.
Don't make me go after her anymore, please.
I was just getting ready to turn to you and say, okay.
So, if I was talking to 16-year-olds, and I do a lot, I don't talk to them about the label, I talk to them about the value. I don't talk to them about rights, I talk about values. And so I would say to both young women and young men, do you believe in the social, political, and economic equality of all genders? And if you do, then there may be things you need to do to make sure that we are striving to get that done. And if you do, and you are searching for a label, you may want to call yourself a feminist. And there is history, and that word is loaded, and you need to understand it. But if you believe in the shared value, then let's work on that. Because we need to, I really do believe we're working to make the world a better place. And the perspective by which we do that is to level the playing field and to raise up everybody, and to set and reset the table. So for me, it's really about why doesn't somebody deserve the social, political, and economic equality, right? Why don't they? And if they do, then let's start having that conversation. Let's see who else needs to come to the conversation. I've been at the Ms. Foundation for 18 months, a year and a half, and it's important to mark down the days. I was counting the days until I got to 365, and everybody told me I had to stop counting the days. But here's why it's important, because my first year at the Ms. Foundation, I did a listening tour, and I traveled across the country. I traveled 53,000 miles in my first year. And I sat in rooms and had in conversation with people that were no greater than 20 people in a room. So it was really a listening tour. And what I heard from people was everything that feminism was not to them. So they would say to me, I talk to young men or men, and they would say to me, well, feminism is not about me because you don't want men in this fight equally. I would talk to the people in the trans community, and they would say, you and some other lesbians, and I'd say, well, I'm not a lesbian. Well, they say, but you don't want trans folk in this conversation. I talked to young women and young women of color, and they would say, feminism and the feminist movement is about old white middle-class women. It's not about what we're fighting for, right? So when I got back to Brooklyn and all of these conversations, I kept thinking to myself, no wonder at 16 I didn't know what feminism was, right? But also, how do we make sure that if we are actually, after 43 years of trying to have a movement get us somewhere, create a movement that actually makes change happen? So I'm about inviting that 16-year-old, those 16-year-olds to the table for conversations about values and then about movement. And I'm going to call that feminism, but you call it whatever you want to.
Melina, what are you telling the 16-year-old?
So I would not lead the conversation with feminism. So I mentioned that I was raised by my mother and my great-grandmother, and my grandmother, who was in Texas, also, contributed a lot to who I was. I left out, and Spirit told me this morning to be as honest as I possibly can. So let me be honest. Another person who helped me to understand my power as a woman was my great-grandfather. So both of my great-grandparents lived across the street from me. And so my grandmother and I, we cooked and we looked at magazines and we talked about Louisiana and everything else together, right? But Grandpa used to pull me out on the porch and tell me stuff like, old top, don't you never have just one boyfriend. You have 2 or 3 of them. So when one mess up, you gonna run to the other, right? So my power as a girl and as a woman came from that, right? And I don't want to call it feminism because that's not really honest about what it feels like for me. So to me, I'm also a mother of 2 girls and a boy, right? And my oldest is 12 years old. And what I try to do is what the people who raised me did for me, which is root them in the power of women, right? I try to, as much as I can, through both study but also through what my own spirit guides me to do, lead them to be a part of a, since you said movement, to be a part of a movement, the movement that we have to be a part of to get free. And teach them that that is tied intrinsically to who we are as Black women. So we have a tree of my grandmother's in the backyard that we pour libations at, right? We tell stories about who my mother and grandmothers are. And then I also surround them with some of the most beautiful, powerful women and people in the world. And so I don't know I'd ever speak the word feminism. I don't know if I ever have. But I think the spirit of how we liberate ourselves is there. And so that's how I talk and try to kind of model for my children. And my kids laugh because they call me Mama Melina, right? Like not just my kids, but like my kids, right? And they tease me and they go, you have thousands of children, right? And so for my children, my biological children, but also for the children who call me Mama Melina, that's what I try to give them.
Okay. So before we get into, thanks to all of you. Wasn't that feeling good going back to 16? So before we go into questions and answers, I want to raise one other thing. Women like Harriet Tubman, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Emma Goldman, Lolita LeBron, Assata Shakur, just to name a few, have all been amazing in making their mark on history. I would dare to say nobody would argue that they ceded power to anyone. Okay. And then we look at the women whose names perhaps we don't know, who've been and were the pillars of the civil rights movement, and have been traditionally the pillars of the Black church, and were the pillars of the Black liberation movement and the Puerto Rican independence movement and movement after movement after movement after movement. That's what we have done. So I want to juxtapose that against our earlier conversation about the definition of patriarchy and power, and ask you, how do you and how would you explain those two things? Do they dovetail well together, or is there more reflection and analysis that we need to do in explaining and trying to welcome more and more people to the comfort level of defining themselves as a feminist? And I'll start with Teresa this time.
So I do, it's such a good question. I'm really.
That's why I'm facilitating.
I think part of why I'm struggling with an answer on this is primarily because I do believe that that women are oftentimes we have innate strength and abilities to overcome challenge and what is placed in front of us. But I also think we have this also keen biological clock. And I'm not somebody who gets into biological clocks. I don't have children. I don't have a biological clock to have children. I don't believe my clock is ticking at all. It's gone. It's never happened. So I'm not somebody who believes in this clock conversation. But I do believe that we have a biological connection and a clock to the earth and an understanding of what that needs to look like, and that we don't get held up. And when I look back at our foremothers, I think about the fact that they were about creating solutions because they understood that their role in the universe and in the world. And we can't lose that. And at whatever point we develop that, we can't lose it. So when I think of Fannie Lou Hamer, or Rosa Parks, or Dorothy Ferguson, my grandmother, right? I think of her understanding and presence in where she was to overcome different things. And to know that it was not about her, it was about her, what she did to pave the road moving forward. And I think we still have an obligation to not only pave those roads, but to maintain those roads that were paved before we got there. And there is, for me, a very critical understanding to the work that we do today. That, I oftentimes say, right, I stand in the shade of trees that I did not plant, I walk down paths that I did not pave, and I drink from wells that I did not drill. And yet I have an obligation to water that tree, to maintain that road, and to keep digging that well. And I believe those that came before, those that paved that way, understood that they were paving the way. And when you go that road, it's hard. And you create the sisterhoods and the families around you that you need to have in order to pave that road. And I think it's different today, I will say that. We don't have family structure around us. Some of us do, but some of us don't have family structure around us the way it may have been before, right? When you only live 6 miles from where you grew up, that's a very different world and a very different relationship. Until I was 14, I didn't know my grandmother really. And when I met my grandmother, I met this, excuse my language, this kick-ass, wonderful, amazing woman who was the first Black woman to work in the front of the store, right? Didn't have a clue that that was it. Was the first Black woman who organized her community to fight for integrated school system. Who led a march across the state of Connecticut and was the secretary of the state NAACP for 7 years. Didn't know that. right? So once you make those connections, you understand and can appreciate, but you have to, it's a very different world, and we have to be able to tell those stories and understand what they are. I am notoriously buying children's arts books about Black history and history in general. But oftentimes those stories told by women and women of color. And I just picked up my new first children's book that I haven't bought one in probably a year or so, and it's the story of Fannie Lou Hamer. And yesterday, when we were having our slumber party, Jackie and I last night, that book was on there, and it was a graphic depiction of Miss Hamer's life broken down, and it was just stunning and beautiful. And I am reminded that for every story that we know and every name we don't, there are hundreds and hundreds that we don't know who have helped lay the brick that we stand on today. So,
Thank you.
I would say that all of our foremothers struggled against patriarchy. Every last one of them, differently. And I would say that historically, what Black women have done is individually confront chauvinism, individually confront sexism. And it's not until the 60s that we begin to see an organized movement wherein people are thinking about collectively how do we come together to critique chauvinism in the Black Power movement and racism in the women's movement. So I would say that, whether it was Ella Baker fighting against, Black ministers and SCLC, whether it was Fannie Lou Hamer, struggling against, folks in the NAACP, whom she called the National Association of Certain People, whether it was Harriet Tubman, who in many ways embodies a revolutionary Black feminist energy. And I want to take a minute, if I can, just to talk about how oftentimes when we talk about feminism, and I love that the piece that you introduced us with, it was like, there were all these different forms of feminism. Just the way in which there are all these different forms of Black feminism. So I always talk about feminism in the plural, because it has changed over time. The way in which Black feminism looked in slavery is different from those blues singers of the 1920s, is different from these activists in the 60s, and it's different for us now. So there are multiple ways in which to understand Black feminisms. And I think, and this is where I think I kind of depart a little bit from Michelle last night, when she talked about how she didn't want to use certain words because people kind of get like stuck in them, and then it's hard to kind of move forward. And for me, I take it. I take it in terms of, because if you don't, it can easily become a powder keg. So it's not like people aren't thinking about these words. They're thinking about them. They're attaching meaning to them. They are defining them for themselves, and they can become divisive if you don't talk about it and confront it. And so I think that talking about and embracing multiple forms of Black feminism is a way in which to embrace multiple forms of a Black experience. I mean, and if we have to embrace multiple forms of Black feminism, of Black experience, just the way we all have different hairstyles up in here, right? We all have different hairstyles up in here. No hairstyle is better than the other. No hairstyle means you're more political or apolitical. It's hair. It's your personal choice, right? It's your aesthetic, right? It's who you are. And we have to have enough room to embrace multiple ways of thinking about Black feminism in a comparable way. So all of these women struggled against patriarchy because they were fighting against people who were stifling their dreams, stifling their liberation, and I think it's important to understand that we do it already individually. Every day of our life, we are flexing, trying to flex power, right? Our own power. So why not flex it collectively?
Surina.
So I want to invite another woman's name into the room. When you said all those names, I thought of my own mother. Her name was Sunny Afzal Khan, and she was not a feminist. She was certainly not a civil rights leader, and yet I learned about the power of women, and in many ways about feminism through her, because she was a very powerful person. She was entitled in the best of ways. And she and my father lived in Pakistan where I was born. And in the 60s, Pakistan was a new country because partition happened in 1947. And so there was a lot of opportunity in terms of the needs that a young nation had. So for example, I used to say my mother was the first woman in Pakistan to pasteurize milk, but in fact she was the first person in the country to pasteurize milk. And I think that she had 5, 6 children, and she thought, I need good milk for my kids. And so she did something about it. They started a dairy farm. They were in the poultry breeding business because there was food supply issues to deal with. And so she was a very strong person, and yet, and I learned in many ways about social change and social justice activism from her. Not that she would ever have defined herself that way, but I remember going home to Pakistan one year, and some of you have heard the story, and I got to our house and there were about 50 school kids in the driveway, and I said to my sister, what is going on? And she said, oh, well, Ummi, which is what we called our mother, is feeding the school children because she saw them going, passing by our house every day, malnutrition, so open sores on their bodies, and she thought they just need a hot lunch. And so she cooked a pot of dal, and then she would have naan, and she would just scoop the dal right onto the naan. You didn't even need any utensils or plates or anything. But she didn't stop there. First of all, they didn't come in, just because there was a pot of, beans cooking. It took some time to say, come on in, please feel welcome in our home. We ate with them. She said, I want them to feel like guests in our home. But we had to work with their mothers to get them there. And then she worked with those mothers because she thought, it's not enough to give these school children a hot lunch. These are just the ones that I see. And so she started advocating with the World Health Organization, the World Food Bank, to say that every child in the world should have a hot lunch, because not only is it about their nutrition, but it keeps more money in the pockets of these families. So, she saw it as an economic security. And yet this is the same woman when, after she got breast cancer and I was going to visit in Pakistan, I said, is there anything I can bring you from the US? And she said, yes, please bring me a prosthetic bra, because she had a mastectomy. And she said, I can't find one here. And this was in the 90s. And I said, oh, that should be no problem. I said, the US government is really putting more money into breast cancer research, and so I should be able to find you a prosthetic bra. And she said, oh, it's enough that you're a lesbian, now don't become a feminist on me. So I say all this to say that she couldn't find a bra. She certainly didn't want to burn it, I guess. But I say all this to say that we have lived in, come through, and still live in very complicated times. And and I'll just end with the issue of how everything is so related, even no matter how we define ourselves. But recently, in the past few months, one of our giving circles in Anuja, who is our senior program advisor for that giving circle, the Race, Gender, and Human Rights Giving Circle, coordinated a trip with a lot of other California funders to the Linwood Detention Facility. And we had the opportunity to see the space. It was very disturbing. We had the opportunity to sit with some of the women there, and I was in a small group with Susan Burton. And I would never have asked this question, and I'm so glad that Susan did. And she said to each one of them, why are you here? What put you in here? And one of them said, because I stole food. She was hungry, she stole food, and she's, possibly still sitting in Linwood waiting for her hearing.
Wow. Thank you, Surina. Melina.
So what you raised for me is really kind of this tension between a patriarchal model of leadership and a womanist model of leadership, right? And so we know certain women's names, not because those women sought to have their names known, right? So Harriet Tubman certainly was not thinking we'd be talking about her now, or I had her t-shirt on yesterday that her face would be on a t-shirt, right? Ida B. Wells became known because she was a journalist, right? So we were able to capture her name, right? And there's other women, Ella Baker and others, you know, who did not do this work. We have never done this work to get famous, right? A patriarchal model of leadership will kind of create a hierarchy where you cast someone up to the top and they become famous, right? And all the rest of us are kind of marching behind them. So there's this kind of misrepresentation, for instance, the day before King Day, right? Where this misrepresentation of the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King came down and decided we gonna get free and get some voting rights, and everybody else fell behind him like he was Gladys Knight and we were the Pips, right? and
quite an analogy.
But that's not the truth of what happened, right? So what does Mama Ella Baker say? She says, the movement made King, King didn't make the movement, right? And so what she's really articulating is this tension between this hierarchical model that black men are really kind of borrowing from white men, right? And a womanist model that is really rooted in group-centered leadership. The idea that all of us are required in order to get free, right? And so all of us kind of bring our gifts and talents and everything that we have to the movement, and that's how we get free. And so we don't know the names of all of these women because the women are in it for the movement. The women are in it for our liberation, and this tension still exists. And I'm just gonna quickly say it's actually almost the identical tension, right? So Mark Anthony and I were talking last night about this kind of tiff that Black Lives Matter has been having with the black male ministers, right? It's the same fights. It's the exact same thing Ella Baker was fighting with the ministers in SCLC, and we're still fighting the ministers in SCLC. It's crazy, right? So they don't like our tactics because we had the nerve. They tried to sneak in the mayor of Los Angeles to speak to black folks without telling Black Lives Matter folks. Oh, yeah, okay. But this isn't the arrest part.
No.
Okay.
We're not going
to. It's the, okay. So.
I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and we'll just say that.
Okay. So it's the same fight. I'll just say it's the same fight, and I'll say that we're winning now, right? The difference is that we're winning now, right? And so we need to lift up the model that is true to us, what Ella Baker calls group-centered leadership. Some people call it collective, some people call it horizontal, whatever you want to call it, right? That it takes all of us, and it's not about your name. It's not about, you know, whose picture is on whatever. It's about getting free.
Okay. So let's circle back to decarceration, prison, criminal justice reform, which is what got us here. And the conversation we've been having, and how does it intersect with moving the needle and bringing about fundamental change that women are central to? So now I'm going to spare my panelists. I'm not going to put that question to the panelists. I'm going to put that question to the audience. Okay? You've had enough time to hear from the panelists, so I'd like to hear from the audience now. How do we center women's leadership with all that we've just talked about in really bringing about fundamental change in this beast we call the prison industrial complex? Yes.
Hi, my name's Anita, and take the microphone.
Hold on one second, please, Anita.
And I was raised in the 60s in Pennsylvania when the Vietnam War started. And, you know, people don't really talk about the patriarchy coming in and taking our young men to war. And that's what they did. One day we're in school with our peers and whatever, and the next day they're at war in some place called Vietnam, which we had never even heard of, And then the next thing, there's the Moynihan report talking about black males were, out of the household, and we were the black males. And people don't really even talk about the fact that there was drugs in our streets around the same time. It didn't just start with the crack epidemic. We had all kind of drugs in our streets once they started the Vietnam War. So when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking of my mother crying, having a nervous breakdown because there were 4 brothers and they were coming to get them. They were going to send them to Vietnam, to this place that we never heard of. Then there was, family members who were going to Vietnam, coming back changed, coming back drug addicts, coming back with limbs missing, And to me, when I think about patriarchy, I'm thinking about these old men that want to start these wars and send our young men to these wars. And I have a son now who is in prison. He was sentenced to 66 years to life, for something that I know in my heart he didn't do. So my struggle is to bring justice for my son, and for others who are wrongfully convicted. I have a cousin, my cousin's son is in prison. He went when he was 16, he's been there 28 years. And he should have been out because he was a youthful offender, but they won't give him, they continue to add on to his sentence, And so my struggle is, with other people who are like All of Us or None, All of Us or None are a very important support group for me. Essie Justice Group, they were the first people to say we need to support families, we need to support you because you're struggling. I was struggling financially because I had put money, to try to get my son, to keep him out of prison. I used money I didn't have to use. And so, almost had a nervous breakdown, But out of that nervous breakdown, I came back pissed off, and I'm still pissed off, And
pissed off is a good place.
Yes, and the feminism, they can call it what they want to. I'm pissed off, and this system needs to change. Not just for my son, but for all of the, for the mothers who are being taken from their children. And they're talking about another war. When I'm saying they're talking about, just because it ain't in the media, don't you think they're not talking about? They're talking about another war, and we as women have to step forward. We've got. To me, it's like there's people that can do it from offices, wherever you can do it from, whether you in academia. But me, I like to be in the streets. I like to be with the people who are being affected.
So you're talking about grassroots organizing.
Grassroots, yeah, in the streets. Thank you.
Okay. Appreciate that. You had somebody up in the front who had an answer?
I may be loud enough. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Well,
perfect.
give it a mic because I think we're also recording.
Sorry. Hi, good morning. My name is Soffiyah Williams, and I'm with the Young Women's Freedom Center in San Francisco. And your question to how do we center women leadership, I believe is continuing to create spaces like this where we are educating to liberate. I think that an inside-outside approach, so this level of education and dialogue being on the inside as well as a strategy for reentry, so we can really begin to interrupt the prison, the school-to-prison pipelines, the abuse-to-prison pipelines, really getting to our young women on the inside, and but also getting it to the street. And we know that's an approach. Getting on the inside is a way to get to the streets because we know those on the inside are talking to people in the streets. So I just think continuing to define this movement for ourselves and really elevating what is oppression. What does oppression mean to you? What is that internalized oppression? Because unfortunately, that is also decisive in our communities. We are torn and split down the middle and we see things differently. We're not defining things for ourselves and we're not owning that that women-centered group leadership model. So I think that This is like food for me. So I know that the young women who are back at my agency, who are the teens, I know this would be food for them. And one note I took was movements and matriarchy. So really studying these movements and how the women have led us out and how they have elevated us to even be in these rooms where we can talk about them, I think is really, really powerful. So thank you again for this panel and just for educating us as the new emerging leaders in the movement.
Thank you. Yes, Teresa and then Missy.
So one of the things I think we have to remember, thank you very much, because I think these comments are really helpful and remind us of several things. One, our history books are full of lies. And I don't say that lightly because, you know, part of the reason we don't know our own history as women of color, as women individually, is because our history books do not have them. And as long as they're coming out of Texas, we're not going to get them. But we negate that. And one of the things we have to continue to remember is that women are not monolithic. Women of color are not monolithic. Black women are not monolithic. So look in a variety of places and ask a variety of people for what that history looks like to them and from them. Because I think sometimes we think we'll go to a spot and get an answer, and we need to go to many spots to get many answers.
No, that reminds me of an old African concept called Sankofa. Anybody in here know what Sankofa is? So in order to understand where you're going, you have to know what? Where you came from. Which I think is exactly what the point that Teresa was making. Misty,
I think
you
I'm
have
just
an answer. You're going to lead us. Tell us.
No, I think I'm actually just going to expand on what Teresa said and maybe just like frame it in a different way because obviously I do anti-prison work as a woman. But I think one of the things to really understand is the intersectionality. What are the impacts? What are the things that lead us there? So I think like being a person who's come from prison doesn't make me different from the Essie sisters who are fighting for their loved ones. My son has been in prison. Their father has been in prison. So we are not really separate. The fights are not separate. Removing the maximum family grant is not separate. That's an economic oppression that leads to constriction of choices, that leads to criminalization. So we have to understand that these things are not separated. And we have to figure out how to actually come together. I think as Michelle Alexander was saying, it is that collective power. It is the ability to collectively understand that our experiences are intersectional. We're not, you know, I'm not just a person who's been to prison. I'm a mother who's struggling to keep my child out of jail because he's not done yet. I'm a lot of things. So that's really what it is. It's not understanding and being so narrow and only seeing criminal justice. You know, I love hearing this. You talk about your history. You know, I came up in the streets, and if you would have told me anything about feminism and justice and patriarchy, I would have looked at you like you were stupid because I was trying to emulate being a man to be strong, and had to learn that vulnerability is the strength. And I think that's another thing. Women were great at being vulnerable, and we're great at showing great strength at vulnerability. So breaking down that patriarchal idea of what strength looks like, and then understanding the intersections that lead to criminality and that lead us into prison.
Call on a couple of other people too, but I also want to raise up something that we haven't talked about yet, and that's we've had a lot of discussion, particularly about how this issue of feminism and patriarchy plays out, in particular for Black women, for women of color. But we haven't talked about, and several of the panelists have referenced, and even it showed up in the film clip that we saw, an identification with feminism and patriarchy with well-to-do white women. And there's a whole lot of our white sisters who are not well-to-do. And who are also struggling with this question of where does feminism fit in for me? And so as we're thinking about this issue, I want us to keep that in mind. We don't want to narrow the lens from a people of African descent lens or people of color lens any more than any other lens, because only through a unified lens are we going to make a difference. So yet another challenge for the audience. Who has their hand still up after I said that? Alicia's going to take a stab at it.
I don't even know if I'm going to take a stab at that. But I don't actually have anything really prepared that I wanted to say other than I feel like building off of what you just said, Misty, is I would like us to be able to recognize that there is a different way that not just women, and again, I love that you said being female-bodied or feminine, having a feminine aesthetic does not make you a feminist, right? And I think recognizing, though, that there are ways that we can organize differently, that we don't have to build off the models that have been laid before us or that are in front of us right now that pit organizations against each other, that make us carve out our own territory and say, this is mine, that really are trying to push us into a corporatized, masculine system that is replicating and keeping us digging trenches and then falling in them. And so I would rather see, even if we have these organizational structures, even if we have to play the game a little bit, that we are smarter than the game and that we know how to really partner with each other and build community, because our organizations cannot stand alone. A woman who is raising children cannot stand alone. It takes a village to build the movement. It takes a village to raise your family, so stop trying to pretend that this American isolationist bullshit is real. It's not. We cannot survive that way. And that's not a feminine way of organizing. That does not acknowledge where we come from and who we are, talking about where we came from, whether it's Kemet, and I love that you took it all the way back there, by the way, or a different type of tradition. We have to hearken back to or reinvent who it is that we are and how we organize, even if we have to play some of these games. And part of that, I just want to acknowledge at the same time, is that we cannot get caught up in all of the ways that society wants to distract us from our own power. And part of that is, okay, use social media, but be smart about it. Because that you can easily get sucked in and become distracted and think that there is some inherent value in being visible and being known to people.
Yes, there's a real value to the FBI.
Right? Yes, you're known, and maybe not in the ways that you think that you're known, right? And it's not about your image and all of this stuff. That is another way that we are getting caught up in things that distract us from our power. And frankly, women, and I include trans women in that, and I include gender nonconforming people, masculine of center women, anybody who identifies along the spectrum. I think many of us have ingested that Kool-Aid and are believing that inherently means we've given up our own power in some ways and feel like we have to conform in a particular way into a particular system. And the more spaces we create like this, where we get to just be real, where we get to have really complicated conversations about gender and about race and make mistakes and still hold each other up in community and not do this, you said it wrong, I'm done with you, I can't believe you posted that on Facebook, I can't believe you liked that article, we can't be friends, I'm over it. Let's just be an actual conversation, not put forth some kind of identity and then get nervous about what the people around us are gonna think. I'm so tired of that. So, okay, let's get our organizational dollars. Let's get the foundation money we need to. Let's work that system though, so that it works for us. Create other structures, break down barriers, get real with each other, and stop all the bullshit. That's all I'm saying. Who's next?
Someone way in the back had their hand up, and then after her, Emily. And was anybody over here? I think this side is winning out on. So I want to hear from this side. After we talk about unity, now let's talk about competition.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for giving all the insight and knowledge that you have shared with us. But I want to go and also thank Gina so much for focusing on us mothers and sisters and daughters of incarcerated loved ones, but we really haven't talked about the trauma that we have been faced with. I was a teenage mother. I have a son now that's 45 that has just traumatized me with all of the challenges that he has had to go through. I've been brutalized through domestic violence, and there is trauma that we are not focusing on. We're not trying to heal ourselves. Not only do we have to heal ourselves, We have to heal our sons that's incarcerated. And we have to bring that attention to them. We have to let them know, as well as us, realize that we need counseling. And the organizations that's being formulated, please put that component in, because we have been traumatized on many levels, starting from slavery. So we have to deal with those issues to become freer, to become happier, because I am searching for that joy that I missed out when I was 16 years old and decided to become a mother who raised a son that ended up who raised two sons that ended up going to prison. So I want to just, thank you, Gina, wherever you are, for bringing this to the forefront. And I'm just asking and requesting that more focus be put on counseling.
Thank you. And as we all know, we are the solutions to the problems we identify. Yes. We can form the solutions. Yes. Emily, how's the side doing? Y'all getting ready?
We had strong representation before.
Yeah, I know. But Emily's getting ready to come with it, so y'all unfortunately ready.
Thank you. This panel is great, and I think as I've been sitting here and thinking more deeply about sort of the intersection around our anti-prison work and patriarchy, and I think going back to sort of what the last person was saying around healing and the need for healing, I think that a fairly invisible conversation in our work, and that one that I hope maybe in this space we can start opening up more, is the impact of, as you know, the PIC being so informed by patriarchy and the impact and the trauma of that on our people, how that actually ends up playing out in our organizations interpersonally. And I feel like, as somebody who's done a lot of mentoring of young women, I think one of the quietest conversations I have the most often is about patriarchy playing out in their offices, and how we challenge that while also centralizing leadership of people most impacted, have often been traumatized by patriarchy from being imprisoned, and sort of that being a place where I know I struggle in my work often. Like, one of the hardest places is right at the center of whatever that is, and I see it as one of the biggest challenges to keeping each other in the movement, that I see a lot of people being really beat down by that in their workplaces and in their organizing, and wondering how we open that up, or even just open up this, like, I have so many people that are more masculine identified in my life that I like wish had heard you all talking today, who I think like have share values, but don't necessarily have the same, haven't had the access to the complexity of really understanding and breaking down feminism the way you all were, to be able to understand how we centralize that in our work. And so I thought some of the things about, like, one of you had mentioned the piece about like the sort of like MLK, the idea of like this figurehead and we're all marching behind, like that plays out in our work a lot. And so I want to figure out how we like name that and work with it in a way that is actually move something forward more definitely in our work, and I hope that this can start that conversation, and one I'd love to be having with folks in the room.
As we're going to move over here, because this team over here has been gearing up. But the question that Emily raised, the points that she raised, reminded me of a very simple 3-word solution. Yeah, it's all wrapped up in 3 words. Educate, agitate, activate. We do those 3 things, we'll claim victory. 12 months from now, we'll be back. Okay, this team, what you got? I think Star, did you have it? I think Star had it. Yes, she did. Okay, let's start. Because she's holding it down. She's been gearing up for you all, and then gave room for the rest of the people on this team to get their questions together.
Excuse me. My voice is a little gone, and so I definitely want to just talk about self-care. I'm coming down with a little cold, and so I'm just thinking about like Black excellence and how much we as Black women put on ourselves to perform, to achieve, and how much of a distraction that is from the actual work. And when we're out on the ground, I worked as the campaign coordinator for Stand With Her, and so when we're out on the ground, we're consistently combating a lot of stigma, and we get into sometimes debates with folks about why we're doing this work and why it's important and where we should be. And I think we can get pulled in a lot of different ways. And I think prioritizing self-care is the message for me today. And then also, I think there's a place for everyone in the movement. And a lot of times with Essie, as we've been building it, you know, a lot of folks love us and they want to work with us. And a lot of people want to roll. And so I think it's been important for me to just know my place and like what my purpose is and to prioritize my own self-care. And you brought up so much for me because I'm just thinking about the whole digital movement now and so much that people say and all of the criticism there and like how traumatizing that has been as a society and as a community and how far removed we've come from prioritizing self-care and prioritizing what our purpose is and exploring that versus seeing what other people are doing. And I see, you know, everything that people are doing. And for me, I'm like, I wanted to be doing this at this age. I wanted to be doing this. I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to do these things. And so I just think it's just extremely important for us to just know ourselves. And you all spoke so eloquently about this, but to just know ourselves and to know what our own path is and to follow that within the movement to center ourselves.
Very good. Okay. Was there a hand over here? Ellen's got something. Do you have something on this? Karen, and then Ellen.
My name is Karen, and I'm a mother. AL 1963 stands for my son's identity in the California prison system. In 2010, he was arrested at 17 years old. He started his senior year in high school, and he was sentenced at 19 for 20 years and 4 months for never touching a gun, for not actually committing the crime, but being part of a group of kids who did. I was devastated and helpless, and his public defender had women issues, and I felt really intimidated by his legal language, and I didn't have a lot of support from his father, so financially we couldn't afford an attorney. So I believed in the system, and I believed that he would not get such a harsh sentence, and he ended up getting the worst out of the 4. So I'm here to find some sort of support in re-sentencing youth offenders. I would love to start some form of movement. I have no idea what I'm talking about when I say this, but stop trying minors as adults because they can't buy cigarettes, they can't drive a car, they can't vote, they can't get a hotel.
Can't sign a contract.
They can't sign a contract. They can't have sex with somebody over 18. For me, they should be tried as minors, and they should be treated as minors because they are minors. So my whole goal is, the only way I'm going to get them out is if we change the law. So, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Ellen. And then we're going to come over here because this team now is feeling jealous.
So I just wanted to start by saying this has been an incredible panel, and thanking each one of these amazing women for your brilliance and your insight, and also to kind of pat us all on the back as a movement. I mean, I know there's a long way to go. I know there are a lot of challenges, but I also want to remind us just how amazing the work has been. In the 70s, no one was talking very much about the empowerment of people who were formerly incarcerated. No one was talking about the fact that there were women in prison, and certainly no one was acknowledging that there are family members and our loved ones who are inside. Look where we are now, folks. I mean, I know we have a long way to go, and I know we're up to the task. But one of the things that changed in the 70s is that a lot of activists started saying, not only, hey, there are women in prison, but hey, there are family members. Hey, you know, this is crazy. Hey, the lawyers don't get to define what the movement is. I'm a recovering lawyer myself. And yes.
I consider.
And I just want to say that, you know, I think a lot of that came from the power of women working together, from the fact that we do it differently, from the fact that we do it collectively as a community. Not always, not perfectly, but we're getting there. There's an amazing thing that happened in 2005. This group of women, all women, came up with an idea of 1,000 peace women across the globe. And they selected women by proportion from every single country in the world and nominated them collectively for the Nobel Peace Prize, knowing they weren't going to get it, but making the point that peace and justice is about each and every one of us. And no, a lot of folks' names will never be known. You know, I loved your story about your mom, Surina. It was very beautiful. But, you know, no, there are a hell of a lot of women who for centuries and centuries, and right now in every single country in the world, are doing what it takes in their own communities to bring justice. So I just wanted to remind us of the power of women and the fact that that power comes from the fact that we don't go with put up that leader and talk about that leader and he is the one who's done it all. No, we're all collectively doing it all, and we will continue to do that. And we will continue to ask the hard questions, because we are at the point in this movement where we need to start talking about some very serious issues among ourselves. Like, what is the racism that goes on in our own organizations? What is the racism that has pulled us down and killed a lot of people, literally killed people in our movement? And how do we challenge that internally and externally? And how do we hold each other accountable? How do we hold each other accountable for issues that destroy us in our hearts? Yes, let's talk about healing too.
Thank you, Ellen. I want to, as we're moving over here to, is this Team A or Team B? But as we're moving over here, I also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that because we are women, because we may call ourselves feminists, because we say we challenge patriarchy, and as Ellen said, we have to deal with issues of racism, we have to deal with issues of hierarchy around class. We have to deal with issues about hierarchy around educational level, about where you live, about, and I don't mean just do you live on the south side or the north side, do you live on the east coast, do you live on the west coast, do you live in San Fran, do you live in the valley, you know, all of that stuff. We always find these interesting, stupid ways to look down our nose at somebody. And that's not limited to people who identify as men. So let's not sink into those same pits, okay? Over here?
Okay, yeah, I wanted to talk. Well, as women, I think we also have to deal with trauma, and I wanted to address what Mercedes was saying. Because it's a long, my history goes back to the 60s, and I was a civil rights and anti-war activist, and I went into counseling because I felt like people had to be healed out of their trauma in order to be able to act, you know, and I went into counseling when there was a mental health act that provided mental health services in every community in the country. It was the Kennedy Mental Health Act, and that act, I saw it over the next decades being destroyed. And it was part of neoliberalism. I mean, that was not going to happen, that people were not going to get affordable help in their communities. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of people don't get counseling just in their own families. And I mean, I know many women, and particularly my grandmothers and mother-in-law's generation, who people came to them for counseling in their houses. But we need something more than that. We need something broader than that. And so part of the fight is to provide more of these services, again, that we had and we needed. But I think we have to understand that it was an intentional destruction, just like the drugs being loaded into the communities was an intentional destruction of people's ability to fight. Because there have been movements, it was a scary movement to the powers that be, what went on in the 60s, what went on in the 30s, and these were intentional ways to destroy people's ability, because you have to be strong and as an individual to, as people have been saying over the last couple of days, in order to make the fight. So, anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we're going to take 2 more quick comments, and then I want to give the last word to the panelists. So, and I've decided we won't have Team A and Team B. We'll have Team East and Team West, wherever your caucus is.
Team we, team we.
Team we and Team B.
We, W-E.
Yeah, I got that. So who are that?
Okay. Team
we. Team we. Okay.
Team we. Okay, let's get in a few quick comments so that we can get the last word.
I'll make it quick. My name is Chandra. I come to this just appreciate everything that everyone said. This Mark Twain quote came to mind where he said, "It's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so." And I'm thinking of that from my background because I am a minister and I come to this so much embedded language that's just harmful. And I think about it from the framework of spiritual violence. And what can we do, in what ways can we look at decolonizing our language around the divine, patriarchal language, God talk, etc. But then beyond that, then how do we segue into what Emily Towns calls, how do we destruct or debunk rather what she calls the, it's really long, white fantastic hegemonic imagination, which is a long phrase for saying, this is very intentional, like Elsa said. Over eons of time, these sort of memes have developed. And so in what ways can we sort of decolonize our own self-understanding and the imagination to open ourselves up to sort of bringing forth, I think, the innate sense of worthiness that we all have. And a part of my work in attempting to do so is to look at how we do reclaim the power of our stories. And so I want to thank each and every one of you for what you shared today, because it's so loaded when not only is it self-hatred, but then it gets sanctified with theology. And then how do you unpack all of those layers? Because not only then are you harboring this sort of self-destructive understanding of yourself, but you think that God actually condones it. So those are the different layers of how I see this work going forward.
Thank you, Sandra. One more. She's had her hand up in the back. All in the back. Okay, let's let us hear this last comment, and then we're going to give the last quick comment. Each of my panelists, think of that one profound thing. You can't use women to hold up 3/4 of the sky. That's already been used. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say I think it's really important that we embrace our mental wellness issues, whether we realize that we have them or not. This is what brought me here today. This is why my son is incarcerated, I believe. There's a DNA spiritual warfare in my family right now. Most of you already know my 26-year-old met his demise at the hands of my 29-year-old, May 15th, but saying that to say, like, he was back and forth to prison, and they know he have a mental wellness issue, but they don't court order certain things, and then they don't abide by their own rules that they put down for my son and whoever else, saying that now they have my son in a therapeutic setting in Santa Rita, and he's amongst like 5 or 6 of his so-called peers, and how are you supposed to want to divulge anything because you already can't talk to anybody in the first place? And then when they say that they're going to see, he's in the mental health section of the jail. Now this just blows my mind because they only see my son 3 to 5 minutes every 60 days. Now we're designed as a species to have human contact, are we not? So how is that acceptable? So you have to first embrace the fact that there's mental wellness issues, and then you got people holding positions that don't give a damn.
Very, very true. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so I'm going to start with
I don't know if it's the last thing, but
Well,
it's the
I mean,
last
well,
thing
well, yeah,
here,
that might-
right? So I'm hearing a lot about self-care, and I think that it's really important, and I think it's also important that we not replicate that hegemonic model of self-care, that we think about self-care as collective self-care, not individualistic self-care. And so for me, drawing inspiration from a lot of the mothers who've lost their children to police violence, I think that part of our self-care, yes, we need the therapy, yes, we need to absolutely hold each other and build a movement that's loving and that is that feeds us rather than depletes us. And I think that it's in doing that, part of our self-care can be banging on the system. I know I get life when I get to go yell at people who create a system that keeps us oppressed. Yes. And so that's all I'll say. But think about organizing as part of our self-care is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Melina. Give me a hard job up here. Okay, Surina, you're next.
Yeah. So I find myself thinking about my partner's brother. His name is Dane. I think he's in his early 60s now. He's a hippie. And he has not really held a regular job for decades. And a few years ago, he had a job, and then I think he didn't have it anymore. And I said, so what do you think you'll do next? And he said, I don't want to work for the man. And I said, well, then you should do what I do, work for the woman. And so I just leave us with that, because I think, to Alicia's point, it's that we can do things differently. We need to unite. We can raise the next generation. We can engage the men in our lives to be part of this movement. We can take care of ourselves and each other while we're doing it.
Now, Dr. Taylor, don't start, because Teresa told me last time she did not want to go after you. So I'm going to let Teresa go, and then...
Thank you. There you go. So I would just end with this. I'm inspired every day. Every time I meet a woman, I'm inspired. It took me to probably getting much past 16 before I could look across the table and see what looked like me. Whether that was race, whether that was gender and ethnicity, whether that was age, whatever it happened, whether it was passion for the work, whatever it was, it took a really long time. So I'm inspired. I'm inspired that you all are here this weekend, that you have given your time to be in this room. Because there's a lot of things you could be doing. There are a lot of things. And so I'm inspired by that. But one of the things I would challenge us all to do is, as we look around this room today and we celebrate each other and we give ourselves hugs and each other hugs and know that we are here for each other, let us remember and ask this one question: who is not at the table with us? And who do we need to bring along? And more importantly, who do we need to bring along that we don't think we need to bring along? Because we make assumptions on a daily basis about people's stories. And what we don't know about people's stories is more important. So I'll tell you this last piece of my story. I have two brothers who were incarcerated. One at the age of 19 for statutory rape charges of an approved and a sanctioned relationship with a young woman who was 3 years to the day younger than he was. And the father decided he was upset that his daughter was in a relationship with a black male. And my brother spent 7 years in prison. I have another brother who happened to be driving too fast, and when they stopped his car, he had marijuana in the car. And enough marijuana to be sent to jail for the intent to sell. And he spent 9 years in jail. I have a sister who lost her children to the system and has to work now every single day to rebuild those partnerships, those friendships, and what that family looks like. So when we talk about what this system and how this system impacts each and every one of us, do not make assumptions about why we do the work that we do and who should be at the table, because it is so important. This system has broken down and torn apart in so many ways, so many levels, and let us all stand together as we continue this fight together. It is why I do this work, because it is personal. And political is personal, and we all have a role to play. So look around. Who's not at the table? Who's not at the table that you don't know is at the table? and bring them into the next conversation. Thank you.
All right, all right.
I surely don't want to go after you. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. When everyone was talking, I was really hearing that, the self-care, and two things came to mind. First, you know when you're on the airplane, they say put your mask on before you put your kids on. And it's so, and I always wonder if I were in that position, would I really do that, you know? But, you know, so I thought about that. So I really appreciate what you said about collective self-care. But I think I'll put closure by saying that the reason why I am invested in Black feminist theory is because feminism can be an analytical tool, but it can also be a way in which to create institutions. And one of my most important institutions historically, I think, is the National Black Women's Healthcare Project. And basically, this project basically explored what is making us sick, right? Whether it's, you know, diabetes, stress, obesity, all of these things are making us sick, but it took a feminist organization to come together collectively to create a foundation and to heal us. So if there is any reason why all of us should at least contemplate on the importance of feminism in our lives, it's because it's one of the few theoretical theories that also has an engaged practice.
Please join me. Let's applaud our panelists.
Thank you.
3/4 of the sky, y'all. 3/4 of the sky.
So just a few announcements before we adjourn for lunch, which I'm sure is going to be delicious. I just want to thank all of our panelists and our wonderful facilitator. One thing that I kept thinking about as this conversation was going on is how uniquely positioned women are to lead and the unique way in which we can lead. And I think you heard that in so many different ways through this panel. That it's not one way, but that we do bring something special to leadership, to movement building. And so I really want folks to kind of think about that over lunch, because I think that's something that's really important, that really sat with me. So for lunch, the children will be back here with us. So for parents, make sure you're on duty during lunch and enjoy lunch with your children. The next time we'll be all together in this room for the next panel will be at 3 o'clock for Sisters Made Visible, the Impact of Incarceration and Violence on Women and Girls, with our next panel. That's going to be really great. I'm really excited about that. Between now and then, lunch is at 12, from 12 to 1. Then there are going to be breakouts. We're going to have 2 different options for you. One is here in this room at the Lodge. Aaron Tanaka is going to do a workshop on making change, movement building theories, and economic justice, which should be really interesting in this room. And then in the pavilion, we'll have sort of tea time talks and hot chocolate walks. So it's, I don't know, it's kind of not raining out there. So if you want to just take a walk with some hot chocolate, commune with nature, you met a new friend, you want to just chop up some of the things you've talked about here, a one-on-one in a group, you can do that. Or if you want to be in the pavilion, have tea. I'm sure you want to sort of connect with someone. You want to kind of have a conversation about some things you've heard and expand the conversation. You can do that in the pavilion, or you can be here. And then there's a free time from 2:30 to 3, and then we'll be all back here for the next panel. All right, so enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you at 3.